You won't believe what happened to me the other day. How many times have you heard somebody say that statement? You won't believe what's happened to me the other day. You won't believe who I ran into the other day. You won't believe the story I just heard. That's how Isaiah starts Isaiah chapter 53. He starts by talking to the people and saying, you won't believe what's going to happen. You won't believe what kind of person it is that's coming. You won't believe what you're about to see. And listen to verse 1 again. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Who? What's going on? What's going to happen? At the time of Christmas, we come to this day and we think about the baby in the manger, and we so often forget that this baby's going to grow up. The question that Kyla asked the kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? It's a question we need to ask. Who is this baby going to be when he grows up? What is the work that he will do? What is the reason that he was sent? This is the promised one after all. Jesus Christ. And we know that he came with a message of hope, a message to tell us that the year of the Lord's favor was upon us, that God was ready to bless and to give his people a great gift. We also know that many people reject the gift, that they would turn their back on what God was doing, on what he had given. They would deny the story and say, guess what's going to happen? Would you believe what's going to come? And they'd say, no, I don't believe it. I don't accept it. Isaiah now wants us to understand the work of the one, Jesus Christ. He wants us to understand that this baby, born in a manger, helpless, came to do a work that we could not do. He came to do something that we would run from, that we would deny. He came to suffer. He came to suffer alone. And he came to suffer alone for us. And as he did his work, because he was willing to do that work, he receives a reward. His work was suffering. There's no question about it. Look how he's born. Look where he comes from. Isaiah says in verse 2, he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. You know what Jesus was born like? Like a sucker off an old stump. You ever see that happen? You cut down a tree you don't want anymore. And you got this stump in your front yard, and you wait, and you hope that it'll just go away. It'll just rot. And out in Ontario, I haven't seen a whole lot of them out here, but in Ontario we have one called Manitoba maple. They're this scruffy-looking tree. And they're indestructible, I swear. You can cut these things to the ground, and within a few months, there's this little sucker coming up, this little shoot coming off of that old stump. If you leave it alone, you've got a brand new tree. It's this amazing thing. Out of what should be death comes life. But here's the problem. Manitoba maple are ugly trees. They're not something you look at and go, oh good, I got one of those in my yard. You cut them down, they come back. You cut them down, they come back. That's just... Right? You can't get rid of these ugly trees. We talk about his work was suffering. I mean, the child's first bed was a manger. Anybody ever laid in a bed of straw? Think about this for a second. He didn't have a comfortable bed right from day one. There was no place for him. He started life suffering. Not to mention which, never mind his social status, we forget about this. Kyla introduced me to a great video this week. We showed it to our young people. It said, what if Mary and Joseph had Facebook? Right? And we're putting their status updates on the event. And the short version of it is, imagine Joseph announcing, that he was going to be married, and then Mary responding, yes, he's my beloved, and then Mary announces on her Facebook status, guess what, I'm pregnant. Right? Could you imagine the gossip nowadays? Because Joseph's friends immediately say, Joseph, what did you do? You're not married yet. Right? And Joseph says, it wasn't me. It was the work of God by his Holy Spirit. And the friend's response is so typical, and it would be so accurate to say that this is how people would have responded in their day, 2,000 years ago. The friend's response is, oh, that's convenient. Right? Good excuse, buddy. Nice steak. Mary's pregnant. You deny it, you blame God. Right? Isn't that convenient? And Jesus is born into this hard life where he's raised as the illegitimate son of Mary and Joseph. He's never recognized and will never be allowed to have social status. People don't want to even look at him. They literally would cross the street to avoid him. Imagine growing up a child like that. They didn't look at him and say, oh, there's that great Jesus guy. He's good-looking, strong, athletic. We got to follow him. No. They said, there's Mary and Joseph's illegitimate son. Remember Joseph claimed God got her pregnant? Right. We forget this about the story. The statement, he's the carpenter's son, was not a compliment. Okay? That's like today saying, oh, that's the guy that is the son of the one that shovels the manure. Okay? This is not a good thing. He's like the local guy that you give the odd jobs to because you can't find anyone else to do them. That's the kind of person he is. And not to mention which, Isaiah tells us in verse 3 that he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised and we esteemed him not. The cares of the world lay heavy on him. I think, and even as a child, Jesus knew where he was going. And the older he got, the more aware he was of the burden he was going to have to bear, and he chose to do it. He chose to be obedient to his Father. But people wouldn't even look at him. He didn't grow up with the kind of respect that we take for granted. And ironically, we live in a society today, just as Jesus did, that people believe when you do something wrong, God punishes you, right? That if you're sick or something's going on in your life that's really bad, God's getting me back for what I did. I've heard people say that many, many times. And they believed that in Jesus' day. They believed that if you were suffering, if you had leprosy, or if you went blind, or whatever it was, that was God's punishment for your sin. And you know what, folks? They believed that about Jesus. When you look at verse 4, it says, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. We esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. We said, the reason you're struggling, the reason life's so hard for you, Jesus, is because God's punishing you. And here's the irony. God had sent him to suffer. They meant it as an insult, but they were close to the truth. That God had intended for Jesus to work through suffering. But he suffers alone, doesn't he? In verse 7, he was oppressed and afflicted. Yet he opened not his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep that before its shearers is silent. So he opened not his mouth. He didn't try and escape doing the work alone, did he? When we get to the cross, when we get to Easter, and we see this baby grown a man, being accused of all kinds of things he has not done, you know what's interesting is that he doesn't try and defend himself. And do you know why? Have you ever thought about why Jesus says nothing? It's not because he's just a big, tough guy and he can take the pain. Okay? It's not because he's just a strong, silent type. It's a very simple thing. Because he's done nothing wrong. When you're innocent and the things you're being accused of are not true, the louder you protest, the more they're convinced of your guilt. And he has done nothing wrong. He's being accused because he's carrying our sin. Because he's carrying our garbage. Because he's suffering for us. Friends, we miss this. I've read this passage a million times. I'm sure you have too. Look at verse 8. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And it says, and as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. In other words, Jesus gave up having a family of his own so that we could have a family. So that we could be saved. And he received no respect. Verse 9, he made his grave with the wicked. How'd you like that to be on your tombstone? They buried me with the wicked. Think about that. How'd you like, even more so, with a rich man in his death? Would you like that on your tombstone? He's buried with the rich guys. Yeah? Probably not, right? This is not a good thing. He's left to be alone. His work was suffering. He had a hard life and a hard death. And he suffers alone. But Isaiah goes on to say that this was God's plan. This, just as much as He has a plan for us, was His plan for Jesus Christ. Verse 10. It was the will of the Lord to crush Him. He has put Him to grief. And when His soul makes an offering for guilt, He shall see His offspring, He shall prolong His days, and the will of the Lord shall prosper in His hand. He gave up children of His own so that He could have us as His children. He gave up all that we hope for so that we could know His Father. I want you to notice this, because this is really important when you talk about the will of God and what God's doing in the world and everything else. God does not like suffering. God does not enjoy suffering. And yet when we read the Scriptures, we see that God is pleased by the suffering one. He is pleased because He suffers for a reason. Because His suffering accomplishes something good. Something worthwhile. Just like a man who takes a hard job to provide for his family, who goes through hard, long days so that the family can eat. We used to celebrate that, didn't we? So Jesus suffers so that we can know God. It was God's will that the work of the one was to suffer. When I was at seminary, so that maybe you remember this, they called theology the queen of the sciences. We've turned theology into something that's considered an arts, a liberal thing. But the truth is, it's the most scientific study you can ever do. Because to know God is the greatest mystery of the universe. To know Him and to be part of what He's doing and to follow Him is the greatest privilege we've ever had. Friends, we've forgotten that. We've forgotten that the suffering of Jesus earned a reward. Revelation 5 verse 12 says, "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and blessing." He was worthy because He did His work well. Because He suffered and died for us. When we celebrate a baby in a manger, we don't celebrate a baby in a manger like, especially us men, when we go see a newborn and everybody else is going, "Isn't he cute?" Most of us are going, "Man, that's the ugliest thing I ever saw." It's this little wrinkled red thing, right? Guys, let's be really honest, right? We don't care about a baby in a manger, but we care about the birth of a hero. If we could go back and see our favorite action star as he was on his way to being that hero that we look up to. Don't we, guys? Wouldn't we care about that? When we see a movie and we see a little baby, we think, that better lead to something good with some explosions. Right? Don't we, guys? Isn't that what we look for? And I realized, I was reading a book this week that challenged me on this. I realized that I've seen the same movie literally hundreds of times, and you have too. It goes like this. There's a hero, and he faces insurmountable odds. And all by himself, he's got to overcome the enemy. And after he overcomes the enemy, going through the darkest place where he maybe even almost loses his life, what happens? He overcomes and has victory. And he gets the girl. And he gets the reward. And you say, "Yeah, I've seen that movie too." Right? And you've all got the name of a movie in your head. But friends, it's this story. It's the story of Jesus Christ, the only one all by himself that took on the forces of evil, took on the enemies of man. He went through death itself, rose again, and he gets his bride, known as the church, the girl. And he gets the reward, crown and a throne from his Father. Doesn't it sound like a familiar theme? My friends, we've missed it. We have missed the fact that the story of Jesus Christ is the story that we love the most. The story of a hero. A story of one that we care about his birth because we know what he's going to do with his life. And we know that even when he gives his life up, it's for a reason. That's a baby worth paying attention to. That's a baby who receives a great reward. It says in verse 12, "Therefore I will divide divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. Folks, Christmas, the birth of Jesus Christ, is a story of a hero. A man strong enough to overcome death itself in order to save those he cares about, those he loves. So this Christmas, I just have one question. And guys, it's mostly for you. Our ladies seem to get this story. Ladies love a hero. They look for a strong man, one that will care for them and protect them. But guys, here's the deal. This strong man, Jesus Christ, the baby in the manger, he's just got one question for you. Will you follow me? Like a sergeant calling his troops into battle. Will you follow me? That's my question for you this morning, folks. Will you follow me? That's all he asks you to do. Would you pray with me?